So, Curating Crises chat, take one. Who wants to go first?
Oh, thanks.
We're on our penultimate day of fieldwork in Montserrat, and we've driven up to a location called Jackboy Hill, which has an extraordinary view across the ocean towards Antigua, and we can see one of the fans from the Soufriere Hills eruption, where places like Trance and the airport used to be and are now buried. And there's also a very somewhat cloudy view this morning, but there's a very good view of the active dome itself.
Yeah.
I'm Martin Marnie. I'm a co-investigator on the Curating Crises project, and I have been looking at some of the historical records of past eruptions, particularly looking at how the scientific community responded to developing seismic and volcanic crises in St. Vincent and on Montserrat, and particularly focusing on the 1930s unrest crisis in Montserrat. So I spent this week on the island looking through some archival records here at places like the National Trust and the Public Library, and we've been really delighted with the amount of material that's here pertaining to that crisis, and we found all sorts of fascinating correspondence between scientists and the commissioner on the island in the early phases of the unrest crisis, when they were working out how much risk there was, whether there was even an active volcano on the island to be worried about, and sort of working out who was a kind of trusted observer that the decision makers could put their stock by. So lots of interesting things to digest and process.
And Matthew.
Hi, so I'm Matthew Neely. I am Senior Archivist at the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford, and I have been working with colleagues at the Montserrat National Trust, the Public Library and the Montserrat Volcano Observatory, looking at the current archival situation in Montserrat and thinking about how the collections can be managed in the future, and looking at collaborations between the various institutions, and also thinking about how we continue to keep documenting Montserrat's unique histories, looking at oral history, audio-visual collections, just thinking about how we make sure that there's a rounded picture of all the voices in the eruptive crisis that happened here in the 1990s going forward, so we just don't have one perspective.
David.
Great. Yes, I'm David Pyle. I'm a co-investigator on this Curating Crises project, and I suppose I came into this project interested in finding out more about the historical responses to volcanic and seismic crises in the Caribbean, and we came from a position of having studied, for example, the 1902 eruption of St. Vincent, for which there was a lot of documentary evidence in the colonial records about what had happened physically, and a little bit about the kind of the formal government colonial response. And we'd also looked in the archives around some of the 1970s activity on St. Vincent. So one of the reasons for coming to Montserrat is actually to try and piece together a picture of what was happening during a previous seismic crisis. And it's interesting, it's a seismic crisis that many people on the island know about, but it occupies almost no space in the formal histories of Montserrat. Yet it's something that people talk about. And, so I think one of the things that we'll do through this project is basically reopen awareness of these sorts of events. And what we want to try and capture through the project, or facilitate through the project, is actually make it easier for us to gather the information about the people who were affected by these events, the people who responded to those events. And so that's why, looking in some of the archives here, we're finding out information not only about some of the missing information about scientists making decisions and individuals deciding where to locate instruments and giving advice to people they're training up, for example, sending advice on how to build an instrument that will do until the correct instruments turn up. But also we're finding the lists of people whose houses were damaged in the earthquakes and then were exempted from property tax for the next year. And so really, even though Curating Crises has had, I think we've done a huge amount of work in about 18 months, the sum of the funding was only ever going to be short term, and that's the natural way of these things in research funding. But we hope it's going to be the start of a bigger project which will have more collaborations, and it will involve other agencies and actors from the Caribbean islands.
Okay, and finally me. I'm James Christie. I am working on this project for only a number of months, and my role is to work alongside the project with the Montserrat Volcano Observatory and the schools on Montserrat. And while I've been here, I have been helping run some after-school workshops at the secondary school based around the volcano, and I'm working with the MVO and the schools to produce educational materials related to the volcano and sensing the volcano, how we as human beings use our innate senses but also scientific instruments to sense and detect and understand volcanoes and learn how to live with them. What do you all think is the best thing that you've found from this trip so far in terms of materials relating to Curating Crises? Was there anything that made you particularly excited?
So I got pretty excited when I found Frank Perrett's original instructions on how to build basically a rudimentary seismometer out of a bunch of weights suspended from different lengths of string. This was a letter he sent to someone who was running the botanic garden here early in the seismic crisis, when there was basically no seismological equipment on the island, and this was something that he sort of recommended to sort of tide them over, a very kind of like DIY approach to seismology. But it's an instrument that he'd used in other situations in other volcanic contexts himself, and it's something that we're going to try and reproduce based on his instructions, and perhaps do so in a way that others could try and reproduce it too, doing a bit of sort of experimental archaeology of seismological instruments gone by. So I think, among many exciting things that I found in Montserrat Public Library, I think that was the one that really kind of brought home that sort of urgency that was apparent in that early moment of crisis, and the kind of the improvisation that was necessary to work out what these earthquakes meant.
Might have been a bit of wind in that, but hopefully
How dare you!
Excuse me.
So I'll just pick out two things. So one is seeing the physical notebooks that T. Savage English wrote up in about 1930, his history of Montserrat, where there's some reference to the Soufrières, there's some reference to the 1843 earthquake, but obviously he wrote those notes before the 1930s seismic crisis. So there's just something particularly interesting about reading things in the original hand of the person who wrote it. And the second thing that really excited me that Martin mentioned is that when after the seismic, or during the volcano seismic crisis of the 1930s, the system was set up so that there were reporters who then wrote a monthly account of the earthquakes that had been detected, and I think they also wrote a report on it. They were supposed to go and visit the existing stations and write a report, and in the National Archives in London, I think these reports finish in the early 1940s, but the reporting continued, and And one of the reporters in about 1945 is a Miss G.B. Scotland, who may be the first female volcano observer on Montserrat. And that. It's always nice finding something that could be the start of another question for someone else to go and look at.
It's very hard actually to pick out one particular thing, because I mean, despite being the archivist on the kind of field trip, I probably spent the least amount of time researching the actual archives for volcanic material, but I've been taking more of a wider picture. But a couple of things that spring up to me: there was a drawing from, I think, the 1930s that Martin found of the Soufriere Hills. I can't remember who was the...
So it was T. Savage English, who David mentioned, who was a historian of Montserrat and also a natural historian.
Yeah.
It was a little scrap from his notebook.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed seeing that. Also, I did a bit of research working with Martin in the public library on one of the afternoons this week, and just reading the weekly reports from 1939 and 1938, just them describing how in Plymouth you could smell the gas from the volcano, and then just how the population might have reacted, and there was some agitation about if it's particularly strong, and then just how they were going up and recording information about the volcano on a weekly basis. I think the other thing that's really struck me this week has actually not been in the archives, is actually just speaking with people in Montserrat about their experience, and when they've told us about how they remember the crisis and their memories of Plymouth, that's really brought home to me how important it is that the people of Montserrat's voice is recorded in the archive, so it's not just the government's take on the crisis, it's not just a scientific take, it's about capturing people's perspective so that in future generations this globally significant event is remembered and can be studied and learnt from in the future.
Following this trip and the end of the funding for the Curating Crises project, how would you like things to develop in future?
We're going to write lots of papers. I think this trip has been a really rich experience because of not only the places we've been to, but actually more particularly the contacts we've made, the people we've met. And there are just so many rich possibilities in terms of putting together, cross-disciplinary teams to respond to different sorts of opportunity. So that opportunity might be funding that emerges from a donor, an institution, a government department saying we want to do something around archives and libraries, and we're now positioned to respond to that sort of thing. It could be something in the public engagement sphere, building on things that we've done in the past, but clearly where there's more potential for the future, and so on.
And we're very mindful that we're approaching the 30th anniversary of the start of the 1990s eruptive crisis on Montserrat, and that might be an important moment in the cultural life of the island. It will be an important moment, and maybe there are things we can do to support conversations around exactly these stories that Matthew was talking about, that are absent from the official archives, but that need to be told.
Good? Are you happy with that?
Cut.
Sweet. Cut.